They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's simply written by the loudest. And in the desert south of Egypt, beneath a sun that burns the earth into ancient bronze, something stands in the silence. Sharper, older, and more numerous than the monuments the world never shuts up about. Pyramids, hundreds of them, lonely, unvisited, uncelebrated. This is the story of the Pyramids of Nubia, Africa's forgotten royal tombs, and the people who built them, defended them, and were erased from the world's memory long before anyone understood what they had given humanity. It begins, like most forgotten stories do, with a shadow left out of the spotlight. There is a moment, if you ever visit Sudan, when the desert changes. You feel it before you see it. A faint shift, like history clearing its throat. The sands grow thinner, more golden, almost willing to reveal the secrets buried under them. And then, just over the horizon, shapes begin to rise. Not the broad-shouldered bodies of Egyptian pyramids, but tall, steep, dagger-like silhouettes. Structures carved with intention, not intimidation. They pierce the sky as if they're trying to remind it of something. Something the world promised to remember, but didn't. Hundreds of royal tombs. Kings, queens, warriors, merchants, dreamers. The legacy of Nubia, a civilization that refused to kneel, even when the world tried to bend it. Imagine a child, let's call him Khamir, walking among these pyramids centuries ago. He is barefoot. Dust clings to his ankles, and the sun presses down on his shoulders like a hand claiming him. He squints up at the sharp-pointed pyramid of a queen, Amanirenas, the warrior who once defied Rome itself, and he wonders if the gods chose this place because the desert is honest. Nothing survives here unless it earns the right to. Khamir's father is a stone carver. His mother is a merchant. His people are neither weak nor wealthy. Yet every year the kingdom builds, expands, learns. The pyramids grow like promises. And Khamir believes, the way children do, that anything carved in stone lasts forever. He doesn't know that centuries later, men with maps drawn by strangers will come here and call his people lesser. That foreign explorers will break into royal tombs searching for treasure, not understanding that the treasure was the lives buried within. He doesn't know that the world will one day worship the Nile's northern pyramids and pretend these southern ones never existed. He doesn't know what it means to be forgotten. Not yet. Nubia was older than its erasure. That is the tragedy. The pyramids weren't the imitation of Egypt. They were its heirs, its challengers, its rivals. History likes to simplify things. North civilized, South tribal. North powerful, South primitive. North remembered, South dismissed. But the truth is more inconvenient. Nubian kingdoms rose, fell, rose again. They traded ivory, gold, incense. They trained archers so precise that even Egyptian pharaohs hired them as elite fighters. They built temples, cities, a writing system still not fully deciphered. They became so powerful that for nearly 100 years, they ruled Egypt. That part rarely makes it into textbooks. But history wasn't written in the desert. It was written in places where sand doesn't bury you when you sleep. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes from being overshadowed. People know your neighbor, your cousin, your rival. But you're the whisper in someone else's chapter. The Pyramids of Nubia know that loneliness. They've known it for centuries. Most of the world thinks there are only 3 great pyramids, as if stone decided to stop being extraordinary after Giza. But Nubia has over 200 pyramids. Steeper, more intricate, built not for ego but for passage, each a doorway between the living and the divine. Walk among them, and you won't hear the chants of crowds. No guide shouting facts like incantations. No vendors selling plastic replicas. Just wind and silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like an intruder in a forgotten kingdom. It's almost painful, as if history is asking you a question you have no answer for. There's a myth that civilizations vanish when they collapse. But that's not true. They vanish when people stop telling their stories. Nubia's story was interrupted, violently, repeatedly. Invaders came. Empires swallowed borders. Water reclaimed cities. Time smoothed out names. And eventually, the world decided that Africa's ancient greatness fit more comfortably within the narrative of a single civilization. Egypt was the jewel. Everyone else was the dust around it. And so the pyramids of Nubia waited. Century after century, some crumbled. Some were bombarded by modern treasure hunters with explosives. Some were stripped for their gold and left open, their sacred chambers violated. But many survived, standing there, silent but unbroken, as if daring the world to finally look up and say, "We see you." What makes a tomb sacred is not the stone. It is the life it protects. Under these Nubian pyramids lie rulers with stories more dramatic than the epics we glorify. There was Taharka, the Black Pharaoh who fought to save Jerusalem. There was Amanitore, the queen who expanded her kingdom with a mind sharper than any blade. There was Amanirenas, the warrior queen who lost an eye battling Rome and still forced the empire into one of the rare peace treaties it didn't dominate. Imagine her, a queen with one eye and infinite fury, leading armies into the desert with a determination that could scorch the sand under her feet. And yet, ask a random person today if they know her name. Most won't. Not because she wasn't extraordinary, but because history isn't always fair. It is often edited. And edits have consequences. When we lose stories, we lose mirrors. We lose proof that people who looked like us or loved like us or dreamed like us did impossible things. A child in modern Sudan might open a textbook and learn more about Julius Caesar than about Amanirenas, a queen who negotiated with his empire and walked away undefeated. A child anywhere in the world might grow up thinking ancient Africa began and ended at the feet of Egyptian statues, never knowing that farther south, another civilization was building its own monuments to power and purpose. The pyramids of Nubia aren't just historical structures. They're psychological ones. They remind us that greatness isn't a monopoly, that genius isn't tied to geography, that forgotten doesn't mean inferior. But someone has to tell the story. Someone has to lift the sand. Someone has to point and say, "Look, this mattered. These people mattered." Imagine walking through Meroe, the ancient city where many of these pyramids stand. The sand shifts under your feet like a creature waking up. The air is thick with heat, but there's something else there too. Something electric. Presence. As if thousands of lives once lived here still breathe through the cracks in the stone. The tallest pyramids lean slightly, weathered by storms they didn't consent to. The smallest ones sit half-buried, stubbornly refusing to disappear. Inscriptions, faded but defiant, cling to blocks carved by hands that belong to people who laughed, argued, dreamed, prayed. People who believed the world would remember them. We failed them, but we can still change that. Memory isn't permanent. It is a choice. And forgetting is also a choice. Sometimes I wonder what Khamir, the child from earlier, would think if he could see the future. If he could see how few people know his homeland once ruled empires. How many people don't even know these pyramids exist. How his ancestors' names are pronounced wrong, or not pronounced at all. Would he feel betrayed, angry, or simply confused? Perhaps he would look at us and ask, quietly, how can something built to last forever be forgotten? And maybe we'd have to tell him the truth. Because forever isn't about stone. It's about stories. Stone can survive wind, floods, and time. But a story ends the moment no one tells it. Which means these pyramids didn't fail their purpose. We failed ours. Yet there is something hopeful here, something almost miraculous. Despite all the forgetting, the silence, the historical neglect, the pyramids still stand. They have outlived kingdoms, religions, invaders, droughts, and the indifference of the modern world. They are proof that even when humans forget themselves, their ancestors refuse to be erased. And maybe, just maybe, that's why they remain sharp and steep. Their shape isn't just architectural. It's symbolic, as if they're pointing upward to remind us, look again, look deeper, look at what you missed. History is not a single spotlight. It's a night sky. And Nubia's pyramids are stars we've ignored for far too long. If you stand among the pyramids at dawn, you'll notice something strange. The light doesn't just reveal them. It seems to restore them. As the horizon glows, the sharp silhouettes soften. The ancient stones brighten. Shadows stretch across the sand like outstretched arms. Arms that have waited centuries for someone to hold them again. You start to feel watched. Not in a haunting way, but in a way that makes you understand why people once believed the dead could see the living. You feel accountable. This place forces you to confront a truth most of us try to avoid. We don't just inherit history, we shape its memory. And silence, our silence, can be as destructive as any conqueror's sword. Nubia didn't vanish in a single moment. It was chipped away, first by invasion, then by assimilation, then by geography, then by narrative. Its decline wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow erosion, like wind wearing down a mountain grain by grain. Humans forget the same way. Not all at once, but piece by piece. A name mispronounced. A battle left unspoken. A queen reduced to a footnote. A kingdom dismissed as a shadow of another. And soon, an entire civilization becomes a rumor in someone else's story. But deep down, we all understand this fear. The fear of being replaced. The fear of being overlooked. The fear that no matter how hard we work, how much we build, or how deeply we love, someday, someone will forget. That is the emotional gravity of Nubia's pyramids. They're not just structures. They're the embodiment of a universal human struggle. The fight against invisibility. Think of Amanirenas again, the queen who lost an eye in battle. She wasn't fighting Rome only to protect her borders. She was fighting to protect her people's visibility, their sovereignty, their right to be remembered on their own terms. Imagine her returning from battle, her eye bandaged, her soldiers weary. The desert wind cools the heat of war. She stands at the edge of Meroe, looking at her city's skyline, temples, houses, and the sharp rise of pyramids. She must have believed she was building for eternity. Yet eternity is fragile. It bends under the weight of modern indifference. If she could see us now, scrolling through timelines, consuming stories in seconds, forgetting entire civilizations in minutes, would she feel defeated? Or would she tell us, memory is like a kingdom, you must defend it. But how do you defend a kingdom buried under sand? Not with weapons, not with walls, but with attention, with curiosity, with acknowledgement, with the refusal to let silence win. The thing about forgotten places is that they don't demand anything. They wait, and waiting can be worse than decay, because decay is natural. Waiting is painful. Yet the pyramids of Nubia have waited with dignity. They remind us that being forgotten does not make you lesser. It makes you unrecognized. There is a difference. Recognition is a choice we make. A choice we can still make now. On the outskirts of the ancient city, the pyramids of Meroe cluster like a gathering of elders. Some lean, some crumble, some stand perfect, untouched by time except for the fading paint that once colored them in shades of red and gold. Archaeologists believe the Nubians designed their pyramids to be steep because it symbolized a more direct ascent to the heavens. A shorter climb, clearer passage. There's something profoundly human about that. A desire to connect with something greater. A need to believe that life isn't just what we see, but what we leave behind. But what happens when what we leave behind isn't seen? What happens when monuments outlive memory? We like to think that legacies are permanent, but they're only as permanent as the people who protect them. And right now, these pyramids need protectors, not of stone, but of story. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the city that once existed here. The clang of bronze tools shaping stone blocks. The hiss of sand under galloping horses. Merchants calling out their goods. Priests reciting prayers in a language whose full meaning we still can't unlock. A civilization full of sound, full of life, and now silence. But silence is not the enemy. Oblivion is, and the line between them is thinner than we think. Somewhere in the world, a child is learning about ancient history. They're memorizing timelines, drawing pyramids, labeling maps, but they're learning only half the truth, half the world, half the legacy of Africa. They are learning what survived, not what mattered. And that is why the Pyramids of Nubia are more than ancient tombs. They're warnings. Warnings that even the greatest achievements can fade when stories are not passed down. Warnings that visibility is not the same as value. Warnings that civilization is not measured by fame, but by memory. And memory is not a gift. It's a responsibility. Nubia fought for its place in the world. Its leaders bled for it. Its people built for it. Its queens negotiated for it. And even when it lost battles, it did not lose dignity. There is something deeply resonant about that, because every person knows what it feels like to be underestimated, to be overshadowed, to have your efforts unnoticed, your achievements minimized. The Pyramids of Nubia are the physical manifestation of that feeling, and the defiance against it. They say, "We were here. We were powerful. We were more than you were taught." And if we listen closely, they add, "And so are you." The sun begins to rise higher. The shadows shrink. The pyramids sharpen again, as if the desert is outlining them with precision. You realize that these structures aren't dying. They're waiting, not for tourists, not for fame, but for recognition, for someone willing to say their names, to speak their stories out loud, to refuse the easy version of history and embrace the full one. And maybe that someone is us. Maybe the act of remembering is the most powerful form of restoration. Stone can be repaired, but memory must be revived. This story doesn't end with an empire falling or a final battle or a dramatic collapse into ruin. It ends with a choice, a simple one. Will we see the Pyramids of Nubia, not as footnotes, not as imitations, not as forgotten artifacts, but as proof of a civilization that built boldly, ruled fiercely, lived brilliantly, and loved its legacy so deeply that it carved its longing for eternity into stone. These pyramids were meant to point upward, but maybe they were also meant to point inward, toward our own fear of being forgotten, toward our desire to be understood, toward the universal truth that every life, every culture wants to matter. And here, in the silent desert of Sudan, among the sharp silhouettes of Nubia's royal tombs, we are reminded, what is forgotten can still be remembered. What is overlooked can still be restored. What is silent can still speak. All it takes is someone who chooses to listen. The desert is honest in a way the modern world rarely is. It does not pretend. It does not flatter. It does not rush to impress or explain. It reveals only what survives. And somehow, against every force that tried to erase them, the Pyramids of Nubia survived. But survival without recognition is its own kind of exile. As you walk deeper into the ruins, the air grows still, like you've stepped into a memory the world hasn't visited in too long. The pyramids stand at angles that feel almost human. Some rigid with pride, some slouched from exhaustion, some half-buried like old men leaning on the sand for support. But they are still here. And there is something quietly heroic about that, because not all ruins represent loss. Some represent persistence. There's a story rarely told about a Nubian king named Nastasen. When Egyptian power faded and foreign kingdoms closed in, he held his land with a calm confidence, ruling not through brutality but through stability. Excavations of his pyramid reveal inscriptions chronicling victories, alliances, and rituals. One carving shows him receiving blessings from a row of gods, each represented equally, none towering over the others. Balance, harmony, a worldview that didn't require domination to feel secure. Yet Nastasen's name is almost entirely absent from global history books, not because he lacked greatness, but because greatness without an audience becomes a whisper, and the world rarely listens for whispers. But here, among these pyramids, you do. The desert wind pushes softly against your face. It feels like a hand guiding you. You imagine an ancient artisan kneeling beside one of these slanted walls, pressing a chisel into sandstone as if carving a line of poetry. He doesn't know his kingdom will one day fall. He doesn't know colonial scientists will loot his work. He doesn't know his own name will be lost while the stones he carved will remain. He only knows the task in front of him, to make something beautiful enough to be remembered by the gods, even if humans forget. His hands are steady. His breath is slow. He carves not for historians, but for eternity, and that intention still radiates from the stone, centuries after his name disappeared. Perhaps that is the most powerful truth of Nubia's pyramids. Even in anonymity, they remain magnificent. But we owe them more than admiration. We owe them acknowledgement. Every civilization believes it will never be forgotten. But the desert teaches a humbling lesson. No one is exempt from silence. Egypt believed its monuments would preserve its memory forever, and they survived mostly intact. Nubia believed the same, and its monuments survived, but its memory didn't. At least not in the world's eyes. It's unsettling, isn't it? The idea that your legacy depends not on your achievements, but on who chooses to tell your story. Maybe that's why we're drawn to forgotten places. Because deep down, we fear becoming one. We fear building our lives, our families, our dreams, only for them to vanish into someone else's sand. We fear being misremembered, or worse, unremembered. And so, standing here in Nubia, the pyramids become more than monuments. They become mirrors. They force us to ask, what will I leave behind? And who will protect it when I am gone? There is a legend that when the last sound of a civilization fades, the land itself becomes its storyteller. In Nubia, the land speaks through silence, through dunes that shift like ancient lungs, through broken pyramids that still cast long shadows, through fragments of temples that refuse to lie flat, rising from the earth like fragments of a dream. The silence is not empty, it is full of stories we haven't listened to, full of voices waiting for someone to ask about them, full of truths the world buried intentionally or accidentally. And when you finally stop to listen, you hear something unexpected. Not sorrow, not defeat, but pride. Not the pride of a civilization that bragged about its greatness, but one that lived it quietly, confidently, without needing applause. A pride so deep that even time couldn't erode it. As the day stretches toward noon, the heat sharpens. The pyramids shimmer. The air thickens into something almost liquid. You realize the desert is not protecting these structures. It's preserving them, like a guardian too stubborn to abandon its duty. But preservation without visibility is incomplete. A forgotten story is only half alive. Nubia deserves to be fully alive again. Not because it rivals Egypt. Not because it fits into a convenient narrative. Not because it adds diversity to ancient history, but because it is extraordinary on its own terms. A civilization that built its own identity, its own art, its own gods, its own power, and pyramids unlike any others on earth. To ignore them is to ignore a piece of humanity's collective soul. History is full of unfinished chapters. This is one of them. The pyramids of Nubia stand not as relics, but as invitations. Invitations to learn, to question, to correct, to expand our understanding instead of repeating a narrow version of the past. But most importantly, they invite us to remember, not in a passive, nostalgic way, but in a deliberate, restorative way. A way that gives dignity back to people who lost it not through failure, but through neglect. And maybe, in remembering them, we learn how to remember ourselves. Because every life is a pyramid of sorts, built out of choices, relationships, beliefs, mistakes, triumphs. Some stones crumble over time. Some remain sharp, but the structure stands only if someone cares enough to look at it with clarity. The Nubians carved their stories into stone. We carve ours into time, but both can be lost, unless someone chooses to keep them alive. One last thought before we leave this desert. The world often chases what shines the brightest, but sometimes, the most meaningful light is found in the shadows, in the things overlooked, underestimated, or misunderstood. These pyramids were once symbols of passage into the afterlife. Today, they are symbols of something else. A reminder that forgotten does not mean gone. That silence does not mean emptiness. That memory can be revived, rebuilt, reborn. And that the stories we choose to tell say as much about us as they do about the past. So when you think of pyramids, don't think only of those crowned with fame. Think of these, the sharp ones, the quiet ones, the resilient ones, the ones that waited, the ones that refused to disappear. The Pyramids of Nubia, Africa's royal tombs, and its living heartbeat,